The Sunfallen Road, Chapter 8. I used the shadow gift, stepping between the streetlights, following him. To this day, I cannot say for sure why. That aura of sadness surrounded him still. He was thinking about something, but I couldn't sense what. His emotions were visible, but his thoughts were clouded over to me. He turned down an alley. Oh no, I thought. Mistake. He wasn't really thinking about where he was going. He was just walking off his sadness. A sound in the darkness. I was running through the shadows. At once I saw him pinned against the wall by one of my own kin. The way you tell a vampire from a human is to listen for the heartbeat. If there's no heartbeat, they're a vampire, or else the walking dead. The latter is rarer than the former, but nevertheless, this was a vampire because the boy was entranced and the monster's teeth was descending on his throat. Stop, I thought at the vampire before me. He blinked, looked around. I shifted out of the shadows and stared at him. Whatever for? The young vampire asked me. He was young, I could tell. He smelled like death to me, but he was far from ancient. He was less than a decade old. He was no match for me. I was 200 years old, an elder, and he was a child. I took him by the throat and forced him away. Because I said so, I said, and threw him further down the alley. He put a hand to his throat, staggering to keep his feet. You bitch! Who are you to interfere? That's not your concern. Go find yourself another piece of prey. This one isn't yours to touch. He rushed at me. I held up my hand, using the trance gift. He stopped immediately. Go home. He said not another word, but walked down the alley and away from us. I could not have said what moved me, at the time, to protect this particular human. He was a stranger, just a young man I'd seen in a club for 10 seconds at best. But there was something in his aura that seemed vivid and beautiful to me, almost sacred. And that was the best and only reason I had. The young man was still entranced, so he wouldn't remember any of what had just transpired. That was good, because technically I had just violated the mask. Come, I said to him, and I led him from the alley. Rather than using the speed gift to get home, I hailed a taxi. Better safe than sorry. In Chicago, I kept my own house, separate from the Regent's home, though I spent as much time in one as I did the other. My home was in a suburb of Chicago, a 3-story affair with 6 bedrooms and a Renaissance-style bath and garden in the 3rd floor of the house. I spent much time there when I wasn't working, and many books were scattered over the benches in the garden. Because of the speed gift, I was able to accomplish hours of gardening and maintenance there in very short amounts of time, so I had built and maintained it myself. The house itself was Tudor style, awash with slate gray paint and lighter cream accents. Inside, it was all wood floors and bold colors on the walls and comfortable furniture. It was the first house I'd ever owned. Prior to moving to Chicago, I had always lived in the houses of those I worked for, and I loved having a place to call my own. I spent much time in the machine room, where I was surrounded by laptops, desktops, gaming consoles, and flat screens. It was home. I paid the taxi driver, and I helped Silver out of the car. He looked up at the house, and his eyes brightened some when he saw it. I took out my keys, led him to the door, unlocked it, and went inside. Where are we? He asked, just now coming out of the trance. We are at my house in Edison Park, I said, putting my keys on the door side table. Who are you? He asked. My name is Melpomene Aguilar, and you need to rest, I said. Did I drink too much? He asked me. I considered. Maybe. We were in the living room. He moved like a zombie to the couch and sat down. Melpomene, I'm hungry. Very hungry. What do you eat? Anything. I will make you something then. Thank you. He closed his eyes, seeming exhausted. I went into the kitchen. Some vampires have the gift of being able to consume food aside from blood, although most of us just throw it up. I can eat food, although I don't get any nutritional value from it, unfortunately. Nevertheless, I do it because it reminds me of what it means to be human. Despite not needing to eat regular food, I still have a strangely big appetite. I pulled chicken, breast, and bell peppers from my refrigerator. I pulled out the wok, a jar of sweet and sour sauce, and I commenced making stir-fry. 20 minutes later, I was finished. I plated both of us large portions, and I turned to see Silver sitting at my kitchen table. He had startled me. I hadn't even heard him come in, engrossed as I was in my task, and so very unused to company. Momentarily, I was annoyed that he hadn't announced his presence. "Here," I said, setting his plate before him, along with a fork and knife. He smiled at me. "Thank you, Mel." And he dug in like he hadn't had anything to eat since the Second World War. I chuckled at his nickname for me, so familiar, as though we'd always been friends, but maybe he was that way with everyone. "You're welcome." I sat down with my own plate and began to eat. "Lady de la Rue told me you go to her house often," I said as we ate. "Marguerite? Yeah, she's very nice," said Silver. "We're friends, sort of." "What do you mean?" I said, forking another piece of chicken into my mouth, savoring the sweet sauce. "She lets me stay at the house sometimes," said Silver. I bit back a chuckle. Marguerite was indeed more tender of humans than she pretended, to let a young man like Silver stay in her house without rubies tendered. I considered him. "Where do you live?" He smiled. "Anywhere. Everywhere. Nowhere." He continued eating. "You're homeless?" "I suppose, although I guess you could technically say I have a lot of homes," said Silver through a mouthful of food. "By the way, if you don't mind me asking, how did you come by this house? It's beautiful, but it's awful big. Do you have a family?" "I bought it," I said carelessly, though declining to answer his other question. "I thought maybe you inherited it or something. You look like you're my age." "I'm older than I look," I muttered. "How old are you?" I just smiled mysteriously at him and said nothing. He laughed and went on with his food. "You're a good cook, Melpomene." I smiled at him again, although his simple remark touched a chord in me for some reason. "Thanks." He finished his plate and got up to get more out of the wok. "You mind?" I waved a hand. "Go on." I watched him as he ate, although not so intensely that he noticed. He was beautiful, not least because he seemed so kind. I was thinking about keeping him. After we finished eating, I took him on a tour of the house at his request. He marveled at the machine room and the library in particular, although he said he couldn't read especially well. "Did you go to school?" "I did, and I graduated," he said thoughtfully. "But I've always been a pretty slow reader. I like to read, but it takes time for me." I laughed and nodded, remembering how much easier numbers had been for me than words at first when I was a child, and I said as much, the revelation seeming to set him a little more at ease. I made a pot of tea, and we relaxed in the library, much as I had done with Klaus all those years ago, except now I was the elder and Silver was the youngling. "I would invite you to stay here with me," I said, as I sipped the peppermint tea I'd made. He paused in putting sugar in his cup and blinked at me. "Are you serious?" "Yes. I have lots of room, and I live alone. It might be nice to have company." I smiled at him. He was thoughtful, his brow deeply furrowed. "You don't even know me, though." "I don't fear you," I said with a slightly playful smile. "Marguerite seems to think well of you, and I am in a position to help. I want to. I don't want to live here for free. I don't need money," I said. "I was taught that when someone does you a kindness, you pay them back for it," said Silver. "Tell me to do something and I'll do it. Care for the house then. Organize if you want to. Cook, garden, do as you like. Whatever tasks you are adept at are fine." He nodded. Glancing at his watch, he said, "It's after 3, you know." I chuckled. "I work nights, so you'll be by yourself most of the days." He nodded again. "Do you have any special rules?" I thought about this. It was an odd question to me, because I had never had to answer it before. When I dwelt in the houses of the regents or progenitors, beyond the rules that were already standard courtesies of vampires, I could generally do as I pleased. But I'd never had to consider having a human in my house before. I already knew that it was going to present certain difficulties, that there was something about Silver that made me want to have him around. And plus, I would not have felt right about leaving him in the street. Furthermore, if other vampires thought he was a vassal, they'd hesitate to attack him, especially considering my role at court. "Yes. Only that you do not disturb me when I am sleeping, that you tell me if you break something or something goes wrong in the house that you can't fix. You are free to use anything in the house when your tasks are finished that might entertain you. I gestured around us. Read the books if you like. Use the consoles in the machine room. Walk in the garden if you have a mind to do so. It was June, and the climbing roses in my garden were a riot of color. There were numerous types of flowers, and vegetables and fruits grew there too. Gardening at night was a favorite hobby of mine, especially just after moonrise. My neighbors thought that I was strange, but I couldn't have cared less. The older I got, the less I cared about what other people thought of me. I adored my garden, and I'd become especially fond of the way roses and pumpkins looked in twilight or under the moon. It's strange how we get attached to peculiar things, but then I suppose the world is a pretty peculiar place anyway. He smiled at last, and he nodded his agreement. You got it. We finished our tea, and I got to my feet. Come with me. I'll show you your room. He set down his cup and followed me out of the library upstairs to the second floor where the bedrooms were. I showed him a room with heavy oak furniture and a canopy bed. The drapes and bed coverings were ocean blue. Whoa, he said, aloud, looking around. Does it suit? I asked. Silver smiled. It's great. Thanks. Where do you keep your things? Or do you only wear what's on your back? I asked him. I still have a backpack at Marguerite's, but I travel pretty light, he replied. I understood that he was saying in a nice way that he had very little. That was all right with him. I also understood that Marguerite cared far more about humans than she let on. I didn't mind. I knew how that was. If it's all right with you, I'd like to give you some money so you can go out and buy some clothes and whatever else you need. He started to protest. I held up my hand. It's nothing. You can work it off. The garden needs some tending. He laughed. All right, just this once. I walked with him down the corridor to my own bedroom, which was chiefly decorated in burgundy and black. Wow, he said. What? I looked up from the bureau drawer I was rifling through. I hate to say this because it's not very polite, but your room is kind of sexy, he said, blushing a little. I laughed. That's the first time I've ever heard that. I was being truthful. No one had ever seen my bedroom in all the time I'd lived in the house. He gave me a wry grin. I withdrew an embroidered zippered purse from the drawer, counted out some bills. I handed them to him. Be careful with this. Separate it if you need to when you go out tomorrow. I'd rather you didn't get mugged. He laughed. Yes, ma'am. He accepted the bills, blinked at how much there was, but put them in his pocket without remark. I think I'll go to bed. I have a lot to do tomorrow. He smiled at me. All right. I have much to do still, so I will see you tomorrow evening. He nodded, and abruptly, he hugged me. Thanks, Melpomene. I was surprised, but briefly hugged him back. You're welcome. Sleep well. He left my room and went to his own. I stood still for a time and listened. Once I heard the sounds of his breathing settle into sleep, I picked up my purse and keys and drove to the Regent's house to tackle the remains of my paperwork. Just before dawn, I returned home and rushed into my room, closed all the drapes and shutters, and buried myself in my comforters, letting the darkness of sleep take me.